I was familiar with this situation and even knew people who could arrange such contracts. However, for me, there were two major obstacles: Sally and the payment. I was certain Sally was not about to leave Boston and move to a desert mansion in the Middle East. It was also pretty obvious that no collection of blank restaurant receipts would cover this expense. Prince W. took care of the latter concern by assuring me that he expected to pay for his new mistress himself. I was only required to make the arrangements. It also gave me great relief when he went on to confide that the Saudi Arabian Sally did not have to be the exact same person as the one who had kept him company in the United States. I made calls to several friends who had Lebanese contacts in London and Amsterdam. Within a couple of weeks, a surrogate Sally signed a contract. Prince W. was a complex person. Sally satisfied a corporeal desire, and my ability to help the prince in this regard earned me his trust. However, it by no means convinced him that Sama was a strategy he wanted to recommend for his country. I had to work very hard to win my case. I spent many hours showing him statistics and helping him analyze studies we had undertaken for other countries, including the econometric models I had developed for Kuwait while training with Claudine during those first few months before heading to Indonesia. Eventually, he relented. I am not familiar with the details of what went on between my fellow EHMs and the other key Saudi players. All I know is that the entire package was finally approved by the royal family. Maine was rewarded for its part with one of the first highly lucrative contracts administered by the U.S. Department of the Treasury. We were commissioned to make a complete survey of the country's disorganized and outmoded electrical system and to design a new one that would meet standards equivalent to those in the United States. As usual, it was my job to send in the first team to develop economic and electric load forecasts for each region of the country. 3 of the men who worked for me, all experienced in international projects, were preparing to leave for Riyadh when word came down from our legal department that, under the terms of the contract, we were obligated to have a fully equipped office up and running in Riyadh within the next few weeks. This clause had apparently gone unnoticed for over a month. Our agreement with Treasury further stipulated that all equipment had to be manufactured either in the United States or in Saudi Arabia. Since Saudi Arabia did not have factories for producing such items, everything had to be sent from the States. To our chagrin, we discovered that long lines of tankers were queued up, waiting to get into ports on the Arabian Peninsula. It could take many months to get a shipment of supplies into the kingdom. Maine was not about to lose such a valuable contract over a couple of rooms of office furniture. At a conference of all the partners involved, we brainstormed for several hours. The solution we settled on was to charter a Boeing 747, fill it with supplies from Boston-area stores, and send it off to Saudi Arabia. I remember thinking that it would be fitting if the plane were owned by United Airlines and commanded by a certain pilot whose wife had played such a critical role in bringing the House of Saud around. The deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia transformed the kingdom practically overnight. The goats were replaced by 200 bright yellow American trash compactor trucks provided under a $200 million contract with Waste Management Incorporated. In similar fashion, every sector of the Saudi economy was modernized, from agriculture and energy to education and communications. As Thomas Lipman observed in 2003, Americans have reshaped a vast, bleak landscape of nomads' tents and farmers' mud huts in their own image, right down to Starbucks on the corner and the wheelchair-accessible ramps in the newest public buildings. Saudi Arabia today is a country of expressways, computers, air-conditioned malls filled with the same glossy shops found in prosperous American suburbs, elegant hotels, fast food restaurants, satellite television, up-to-date hospitals, high-rise office towers, and amusement parks featuring whirling rides. The plans we conceived in 1974 set a standard for future negotiations with oil-rich countries. In a way, Sama Jacor was the next plateau after the one Kermit Roosevelt had established in Iran. It introduced an innovative level of sophistication to the arsenal of political, economic weapons used by a new breed of soldiers for global empire. The Saudi Arabia money laundering affair and the Joint Commission also set new precedents for international jurisprudence. This was very evident in the case of Idi Amin. When the notorious Ugandan dictator went into exile in 1979, he was given asylum in Saudi Arabia, although he was considered a murderous despot responsible for the deaths of between 100,000 and 300,000 people. He retired to a life of luxury, complete with cars and domestic servants provided by the House of Saud. The United States quietly objected, but refused to press the issue for fear of undermining its arrangement with the Saudis. Amin whiled away his last years, fishing and taking strolls on the beach. In 2003, he died in Jeddah, succumbing to kidney failure at the age of 80. More subtle, and ultimately much more damaging, was the role Saudi Arabia was allowed to play in financing international terrorism. The United States made no secret of its desire to have the House of Saud bankroll Osama bin Laden's Afghan war against the Soviet Union during the 1980s. And Riyadh and Washington together contributed an estimated $3.5 billion to the Mujahideen. However, U.S. and Saudi participation went far beyond this. In late 2003, U.S. News & World Report conducted an exhaustive study titled The Saudi Connection. The magazine reviewed thousands of pages of court records, U.S. and foreign intelligence reports, and other documents, and interviewed dozens of government officials and experts on terrorism and the Middle East. Its findings include the following. The evidence was indisputable. Saudi Arabia, America's longtime ally and the world's largest oil producer, had somehow become, as a senior Treasury Department official put it, the epicenter of terrorist financing. Starting in the late 1980s, after the dual shocks of the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet war in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia's quasi-official charities became the primary source of funds for the fast-growing jihad movement. In some 20 countries, the money was used to run paramilitary training camps, purchase weapons, and recruit new members. Saudi largesse encouraged U.S. officials to look the other way. Some veteran intelligence officers say, billions of dollars in contracts, grants, and salaries have gone to a broad range of former U.S. officials who had dealt with the Saudis, ambassadors, CIA station chiefs, even cabinet secretaries. Electronic intercepts of conversations implicated members of the royal family in backing not only al-Qaeda, but also other terrorist groups. After the 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, more evidence emerged about the covert relationships between Washington and Riyadh. In October 2003, Vanity Fair magazine disclosed information that had not previously been made public in an in-depth report titled Saving the Saudis. The story that emerged about the relationship between the Bush family, the House of Saud, and the bin Laden family did not surprise me. I knew that those relationships went back at least to the time of the Saudi Arabian money laundering affair, which began in 1974, and to George H.W. Bush's terms as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations from 1971 to 1973, and then as head of the CIA from 1976 to 1977. What surprised me was the fact that the truth had finally made the press. Vanity Fair concluded, the Bush family and the House of Saud, the two most powerful dynasties in the world, have had close personal, business, and political ties for more than 20 years. In the private sector, the Saudis supported Harkin Energy, a struggling oil company in which George W. Bush was an investor. Most recently, former President George H.W. Bush and his longtime ally, former Secretary of State James A. Baker III, have appeared before Saudis at fundraisers for the Carlyle Group, arguably the biggest private equity firm in the world. Today, former President Bush continues to serve as a senior advisor to the firm, whose investors allegedly include a Saudi accused of ties to terrorist support groups. Just days after 9/11, wealthy Saudi Arabians, including members of the bin Laden family, were whisked out of the U.S. on private jets. No one will admit to clearing the flights, and the passengers weren't questioned. Did the Bush family's long relationship with the Saudis help make it happen? Part 3, 1975 to 1981. Chapter 17. Panama Canal Negotiations and Graham Greene. Saudi Arabia made many careers. Mine was already well on the way, but my successes in the Desert Kingdom certainly opened new doors for me. By 1977, I had built a small empire that included a staff of around 20 professionals headquartered in our Boston office, and a stable of consultants from Maine's other departments and offices scattered across the globe. I had become the youngest partner in the firm's 100-year history. In addition to my title of chief economist, I was named Manager of Economics and Regional Planning. I was lecturing at Harvard and other venues, and newspapers were soliciting articles from me about current events. I owned a sailing yacht that was docked in Boston Harbor next to the historic battleship Constitution, Old Ironsides, renowned for subduing the Barbary pirates not long after the Revolutionary War. I was being paid an excellent salary, and I had equity that promised to elevate me to the rarefied heights of millionaire well before I turned 40. True, my marriage had fallen apart, but I was spending time with beautiful and fascinating women on several continents. Bruno came up with an idea for an innovative approach to forecasting, an econometric model based on the writings of a turn-of-the-century Russian mathematician. The model involved assigning subjective probabilities to predictions that certain specific sectors of an economy would grow. It seemed an ideal tool to justify the inflated rates of increase we like to show in order to obtain large loans, and Bruno asked me to see what I could do with the concept. I brought a young MIT mathematician, Dr. Nadipuram Prasad, into my department and gave him a budget. Within 6 months, he developed the Markov method for econometric modeling. Together, we hammered out a series of technical papers that presented Markov as a revolutionary method for forecasting the impact of infrastructure investment on economic development. It was exactly what we wanted, a tool that scientifically proved we were doing countries a favor by helping them incur debts they would never be able to pay off. In addition, only a highly skilled econometrician with lots of time and money could possibly comprehend the intricacies of Markov or question its conclusions. The papers were published by several prestigious organizations, and we formally presented them at conferences and universities in a number of countries. The papers, and we, became famous throughout the industry. Omar Torrijos and I honored our secret agreement. I made sure our studies were honest and that our recommendations took into account the poor. Although I heard grumbling that my forecasts in Panama were not up to their usual inflated standards, and even that they smacked of socialism, the fact was that Maine kept winning contracts from the Torrijos government. These contracts included a first, to provide innovative master plans that involved agriculture along with the more traditional infrastructure sectors. I also watched from the sidelines as Torrijos and Jimmy Carter set out to renegotiate the Canal Treaty. The canal negotiations generated great interest and great passions around the world. People everywhere waited to see whether the United States would do what most of the rest of the world believed was the right thing, allow the Panamanians to take control, or would instead try to re-establish our global version of manifest destiny, which had been shaken by our Vietnam debacle. For many, it appeared that a reasonable and compassionate man had been elected to the U.S. presidency at just the right time. However, the conservative bastions of Washington and the pulpits of the religious right rang with indignation. How could we give up this bulwark of national defense, this symbol of U.S. ingenuity, this ribbon of water that tied South America's fortunes to the whims of U.S. commercial interests? During my trips to Panama, I became accustomed to staying at the Hotel Continental. However, on my fifth visit, I moved across the street to the Hotel Panama, because the Continental was undergoing renovations, and the construction was very noisy. At first, I resented the inconvenience. The Continental had been my home away from home. But now, the expansive lobby where I sat, with its rattan chairs and paddle-bladed wood ceiling fans, was growing on me. It could have been the set of Casablanca, and I fantasized that Humphrey Bogart might stroll in at any moment. I set down the copy of the New York Review of Books, in which I had just finished reading a Graham Greene article about Panama, and stared up at those fans, recalling an evening almost 2 years earlier. Ford is a weak president who won't be re-elected, Omar Torrijos predicted in 1975. He was speaking to a group of influential Panamanians. I was one of the few foreigners who had been invited to the elegant old club with its whirring ceiling fans. That's the reason I decided to accelerate this canal issue. It's a good time to launch an all-out political battle to win it back. The speech inspired me. I returned to my hotel room and scratched out a letter that I eventually mailed to the Boston Globe. Back in Boston, an editor responded by calling me at my office to request that I write an op-ed piece. Colonialism in Panama has no place in 1975. Took up nearly half the page, opposite the editorials, in the September 19, 1975 edition. The article cited 3 specific reasons for transferring the canal to Panama. First, the present situation is unjust, a good reason for any decision. Second, the existing treaty creates far graver security risks than would result from turning more control over to the Panamanians. I referenced a study conducted by the Interoceanic Canal Commission, which concluded that traffic could be halted for 2 years by a bomb planted, conceivably by one man, in the side of Gatun Dam, a point General Torrijos himself had publicly emphasized. And third, the present situation is creating serious problems for already troubled United States-Latin American relations. I ended with the following. The best way of assuring the continued and efficient operation of the canal is to help Panamanians gain control over and responsibility for it. In so doing, we could take pride in initiating an action that would reaffirm commitments to the cause of self-determination, to which we pledged ourselves 200 years ago. Colonialism was in vogue at the turn of the century, early 1900s, as it had been in 1775. Perhaps ratification of such a treaty can be understood in the context of those times. Today, it is without justification. Colonialism has no place in 1975. We, celebrating our bicentennial, should realize this and act accordingly. Writing that piece was a bold move on my part, especially since I had recently been made a partner at Maine. Partners were expected to avoid the press, and certainly to refrain from publishing political diatribes on the editorial pages of New England's most prestigious newspaper. I received through interoffice mail a pile of nasty, mostly anonymous notes stapled to copies of the article. I was certain that I recognized the handwriting on one as that of Charlie Illingworth. My first project manager had been at Maine for over 10 years, compared to less than 5 for me, and was not yet a partner. A fierce skull and crossbones figured prominently on the note, and its message was simple. Is this commie really a partner in our firm? Bruno summoned me to his office and said, "You'll get loads of grief over this. Maine's a pretty conservative place. But I want you to know I think you're smart. Torrijos will love it. I do hope you're sending him a copy. Good. Well, these jokers here in this office, the ones who think Torrijos is a socialist, really won't give a damn as long as the work flows in. Bruno had been right, as usual. Now it was 1977, Carter was in the White House, and serious canal negotiations were underway. Many of Maine's competitors had taken the wrong side and had been turned out of Panama, but our work had multiplied. And I was sitting in the lobby of the Hotel Panama, having just finished reading an article by Graham Greene in the New York Review of Books. The article, "The Country with 5 Frontiers," was a gutsy piece that included a discussion of corruption among senior officers in Panama's National Guard. The author pointed out that the general himself admitted to giving many of his staff special privileges, such as superior housing, because, "If I don't pay them, the CIA will." The clear implication was that the U.S. intelligence community was determined to undermine the wishes of President Carter and, if necessary, would bribe Panama's military chiefs into sabotaging the treaty negotiations. I could not help but wonder if the jackals had begun to circle Torrijos. I had seen a photograph in the People section of Time or Newsweek of Torrijos and Greene sitting together. The caption indicated that the writer was a special guest who had become a good friend. I wondered how the general felt about this novelist, whom he apparently trusted, writing such a critique. Graham Greene's article raised another question, one that related to that day in 1972 when I had sat across a coffee table from Torrijos. At the time, I had assumed that Torrijos knew the foreign aid game was there to make him rich, while shackling his country with debt. I had been sure he knew that the process was based on the assumption that men in power are corruptible, and that his decision not to seek personal benefit, but rather to use foreign aid to truly help his people, would be seen as a threat that might eventually topple the entire system. The world was watching this man. His actions had ramifications that reached far beyond Panama, and would therefore not be taken lightly. I had wondered how the corporatocracy would react if loans made to Panama helped the poor without contributing to impossible debts. Now I wondered whether Torrijos regretted the deal he and I had struck that day, and I wasn't quite sure how I felt about those deals myself. I had stepped back from my EHM role. I had played his game instead of mine, accepting his insistence on honesty in exchange for more contracts. In purely economic terms, it had been a wise business decision for Maine. Nonetheless, it had been inconsistent with what Claudine had instilled in me. It was not advancing the global empire. Had it now unleashed the jackals? I recalled thinking when I left Torrijos' bungalow that day that Latin American history is littered with dead heroes. A system based on corrupting public figures does not take kindly to public figures who refuse to be corrupted. Then I thought my eyes were playing tricks. A familiar figure was walking slowly across the lobby. At first I was so confused that I believed it was Humphrey Bogart, but Bogart was long deceased. Then I recognized the man ambling past me as one of the great figures in modern English literature, author of The Pride and the Glory, The Comedians, Our Man in Havana, and of the article I had just set down on the table next to me. Graham Greene hesitated a moment, peered around, and headed for the coffee shop. I was tempted to call out or to run after him, but I stopped myself. An inner voice said he needed his privacy. Another warned that he would shun me. I picked up the New York Review of Books, and was surprised a moment later to discover that I was standing in the doorway to the coffee shop. I had breakfasted earlier that morning, and the maitre d' gave me an odd look. I glanced around. Graham Greene sat alone at a table near the wall. I pointed to the table beside him. "Over there," I told the maitre d'. "Can I sit there for another breakfast?" I was always a good tipper. The maitre d' smiled knowingly and led me to the table. The novelist was absorbed in his newspaper. I ordered coffee and a croissant with honey. I wanted to discover Green's thoughts about Panama, Torrijos, and the canal affair, but had no idea how to initiate such a conversation. Then he looked up to take a sip from his glass. "Excuse me," I said. He glared at me, or so it seemed. "Yes?" "I hate to intrude, but you are Graham Greene, aren't you?" "Why, yes, indeed." He smiled warmly. "Most people in Panama don't recognize me." I gushed that he was my favorite novelist, and then gave him a brief life history, including my work at Maine and my meetings with Torrijos. He asked if I was the consultant who had written an article about the United States getting out of Panama. In the Boston Globe, if I recall correctly. I was flabbergasted. "A courageous thing to do, given your position," he said. "Won't you join me?" I moved to his table and sat there with him for what must have been an hour and a half. I realized as we chatted how very close to Torrijos he had grown. He spoke of the general at times like a father speaking about his son. "The general," he said, "invited me to write a book about his country. I'm doing just that. This one will be nonfiction, something a bit off the line for me." I asked him why he usually wrote novels instead of nonfiction. "Fiction is safer," he said. "Most of my subject matter is controversial. Vietnam, Haiti, the Mexican Revolution. A lot of publishers would be afraid to publish nonfiction about these matters." He pointed at the New York Review of Books, where it lay on the table I had vacated. "Words like those can cause a great deal of damage." Then he smiled. "Besides, I like to write fiction. It gives me much greater freedom." He looked at me intensely. "The important thing is to write about things that matter, like your Globe article about the canal." His admiration for Torrijos was obvious. It seemed that Panama's head of state could impress a novelist every bit as much as he impressed the poor and dispossessed. Equally obvious was Green's concern for his friend's life. "It's a huge endeavor," he exclaimed, taking on the giant of the North. He shook his head sadly. "I fear for his safety." Then it was time for him to leave. "Must catch a flight to France," he said, rising slowly and shaking my hand. He peered into my eyes. "Why don't you write a book?" He gave me an encouraging nod. "It's in you. But remember, make it about things that matter." He turned and walked away. Then he stopped and came back a few steps into the restaurant. "Don't worry," he said. "The general will prevail. He'll get the canal back." Torrijos did get it back. In that same year, 1977, he successfully negotiated new treaties with President Carter that transferred the canal zone and the canal itself over to Panamanian control. Then the White House had to convince the U.S. Congress to ratify it. A long and arduous battle ensued. In the final tally, the Canal Treaty was ratified by a single vote. Conservatives swore revenge. When Graham Greene's nonfiction book, Getting to Know the General, came out many years later, it was dedicated to the friends of my friend Omar Torrijos in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Panama. Chapter 18. Iran's King of Kings. Between 1975 and 1978, I frequently visited Iran. Sometimes I commuted between Latin America or Indonesia and Tehran. The Shah of Shahs, literally King of Kings, his official title, presented a completely different situation from that in the other countries where we worked. Iran was oil-rich and, like Saudi Arabia, it did not need to incur debt in order to finance its ambitious list of projects. However, Iran differed significantly from Saudi Arabia in that its large population, while predominantly Middle Eastern and Muslim, was not Arabic. In addition, the country had a history of political turmoil, both internally and in its relationships with its neighbors. Therefore, we took a different approach. Washington and the business community joined forces to turn the Shah into a symbol of progress. We launched an immense effort to show the world what a strong, democratic friend of U.S. corporate and political interests could accomplish. Never mind his obviously undemocratic title, or the less obvious fact of the CIA-orchestrated coup against his democratically elected premier. Washington and its European partners were determined to present the Shah's government as an alternative to those in Iraq, Libya, China, Korea, and other nations where a powerful undercurrent of anti-Americanism was surfacing. To all appearances, the Shah was a progressive friend of the underprivileged. In 1962, he ordered large private landholdings broken up and turned over to peasant owners. The following year, he inaugurated his White Revolution, which involved an extensive agenda for socio-economic reforms. The power of OPEC grew during the 1970s, and the Shah became an increasingly influential world leader. At the same time, Iran developed one of the most powerful military forces in the Muslim Middle East. Maine was involved in projects that covered most of the country, from tourist areas along the Caspian Sea in the north to secret military installations overlooking the Straits of Hormuz in the south. Once again, the focus of our work was to forecast regional development potentials and then to design electrical generating, transmission, and distribution systems that would provide the all-important energy required to fuel the industrial and commercial growth that would realize these forecasts. I visited most of the major regions of Iran at one time or another. I followed the old caravan trail through the desert mountains, from Kerman to Bandar Abbas, and I roamed the ruins of Persepolis, the legendary palace of ancient kings, and one of the wonders of the classical world. I toured the country's most famous and spectacular sites, Shiraz, Isfahan, and the magnificent tent city near Persepolis where the Shah had been crowned. In the process, I developed a genuine love for this land and its complex people. On the surface, Iran seemed to be a model example of Christian-Muslim cooperation. However, I soon learned that tranquil appearances may mask deep resentment. Late one evening in 1977, I returned to my hotel room to find a note shoved under my door. I was shocked to discover that it was signed by a man named Yamin. I had never met him, but he had been described to me during a government briefing as a famous and most subversive radical. In beautifully crafted English script, the note invited me to meet him at a designated restaurant. However, there was a warning. I was to come only if I was interested in exploring a side of Iran that most people in my position never saw. I wondered whether Yamin knew what my true position was. I realized that I was taking a big risk. However, I could not resist the temptation to meet this enigmatic figure. My taxi dropped me off in front of a tiny gate in a high wall, so high that I could not see the building behind it. A beautiful Iranian woman, wearing a long black gown, ushered me in and led me down a corridor illuminated by ornate oil lamps hanging from a low ceiling. At the end of this corridor, we entered a room that dazzled like the interior of a diamond, blinding me with its radiance. When my eyes finally adjusted, I saw that the walls were inlaid with semi-precious stones and mother-of-pearl. The restaurant was lighted by tall white candles, protruding from intricately sculpted bronze chandeliers. A tall man with long black hair, wearing a tailored navy blue suit, approached and shook my hand. He introduced himself as Yamin, in an accent that suggested he was an Iranian who had been educated in the British school system, and I was immediately struck by how little he looked like a subversive radical. He directed me past several tables where couples sat quietly eating, to a very private alcove. He assured me we could talk in complete confidentiality. I had the distinct impression that this restaurant catered to secret rendezvous. Ours, quite possibly, was the only non-amorous one that night. Yamin was very cordial, During our discussion, it became obvious that he thought of me merely as an economic consultant, not as someone with ulterior motives. He explained that he had singled me out because he knew I had been a Peace Corps volunteer, and because he had been told that I took every possible opportunity to get to know his country and to mix with its people. "You are very young compared to most in your profession," he said. "You have a genuine interest in our history and our current problems. You represent our hope." This, as well as the setting, his appearance, and the presence of so many others in the restaurant, gave me a certain degree of comfort. I had become accustomed to people befriending me, like Razzie in Java and Fidel in Panama, and I accepted it as a compliment and an opportunity. I knew that I stood out from other Americans because I was in fact infatuated with the places I visited. I have found that people warm to you very quickly if you open your eyes, ears, and heart to their culture. Yemen asked if I knew about the Flowering Desert Project. "The Shah believes that our deserts were once fertile plains and lush forests. At least, that's what he claims. During Alexander the Great's reign, according to this theory, vast armies swept across these lands, traveling with millions of goats and sheep. The animals ate all the grass and other vegetation. The disappearance of these plants caused a drought, and eventually the entire region became a desert. Now, all we have to do, or so the Shah says, is plant millions upon millions of trees. After that, presto, the rains will return, and the desert will bloom again. Of course, in the process, we will have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars." He smiled condescendingly. "Companies like yours will reap huge profits." "I take it you don't believe in this theory. The desert is a symbol. Turning it green is about much more than agriculture." Several waiters descended upon us with trays of beautifully presented Iranian food. Asking my permission first, Yemen proceeded to select an assortment from the various trays. Then he turned back to me. "A question for you, Mr. Perkins, if I might be so bold. What destroyed the cultures of your own native peoples, the Indians?" I responded that I felt there had been many factors, including greed and superior weapons. "Yes, true, all of that. But more than anything else, did it not come down to a destruction of the environment?" He went on to explain how once forests and animals such as the buffalo are destroyed, and once people are moved onto reservations, the very foundations of cultures collapse. "You see, it is the same here," he said. "The desert is our environment. The Flowering Desert Project threatens nothing less than the destruction of our entire fabric. How can we allow this to happen?" I told him that it was my understanding that the whole idea behind the project came from his people. He responded with a cynical laugh, saying that the idea was planted in the Shah's mind by my own United States government, and that the Shah was just a puppet of that government. "A true Persian would never permit such a thing," Yemen said. Then he launched into a long dissertation about the relationship between his people, the Bedouins, and the desert. He emphasized the fact that many urbanized Iranians take their vacations in the desert. They set up tents large enough for the entire family and spend a week or more living in them. "We, my people, are part of the desert. The people the Shah claims to rule with that iron hand of his are not just of the desert. We are the desert." After that, he told me stories about his personal experiences in the desert. When the evening was over, he escorted me back to the tiny door in the large wall. My taxi was waiting in the street outside. Yemen shook my hand and expressed his appreciation for the time I had spent with him. He again mentioned my young age, and my openness, and the fact that my occupying such a position gave him hope for the future. "I am so glad to have had this time with a man like you." He continued to hold my hand in his. "I would request of you only one more favor. I do not ask this lightly. I do it only because, after our time together tonight, I know it will be meaningful to you. You'll gain a great deal from it." What is it I can do for you? I would like to introduce you to a dear friend of mine, a man who can tell you a great deal about our King of Kings. He may shock you, but I assure you that meeting him will be well worth your time. Chapter 19. Confessions of a Tortured Man. Several days later, Yamin drove me out of Tehran, through a dusty and impoverished shanty town, along an old camel trail, and out to the edge of the desert. With the sun setting behind the city, he stopped his car at a cluster of tiny mud shacks, surrounded by palm trees. A very old oasis, he explained, dating back centuries before Marco Polo. He preceded me to one of the shacks. The man inside has a Ph.D. from one of your most prestigious universities. For reasons that will soon be clear, he must remain nameless. You can call him Doc. He knocked on the wooden door, and there was a muffled response. Yamin pushed the door open and led me inside. The tiny room was windowless, and lit only by an oil lamp on a low table in one corner. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the dirt floor was covered with Persian carpets. Then the shadowy outline of a man began to emerge. He was seated in front of the lamp in a way that kept his features hidden. I could tell only that he was bundled in blankets and was wearing something around his head. He sat in a wheelchair, and other than the table, this was the only piece of furniture in the room. Yamin motioned for me to sit on a carpet. He went up and gently embraced the man, speaking a few words in his ear, then returned and sat at my side. "I've told you about Mr. Perkins," he said. "We're both honored to have this opportunity to visit with you, sir." "Mr. Perkins, you are welcome." The voice, with barely any detectable accent, was low and hoarse. I found myself leaning forward into the small space between us, as he said, "You see before you a broken man. I have not always been so. Once I was strong like you. I was a close and trusted adviser to the Shah." There was a long pause. "The Shah of Shahs, King of Kings." His tone of voice sounded, I thought, more sad than angry. "I personally knew many of the world's leaders, Eisenhower, Nixon, de Gaulle. They trusted me to help lead this country into the capitalist camp. The Shah trusted me, and—" He made a sound that could have been a cough, but which I took for a laugh. "I trusted the Shah. I believed his rhetoric. I was convinced that Iran would lead the Muslim world into a new epoch, that Persia would fulfill its promise. It seemed our destiny, the Shah's, mine, all of ours, who carried out the mission we thought we had been born to fulfill.